Hello, everybody. So welcome firstly, and I think we'll make a start. Like I said, we've still got people joining, but we'll get going. So just firstly, I want to say how pleased I am that so many of you could join us. I think we had about 300 registrations for this one, so it's really kind of great to see such an appetite for thinking through these issues around well-being and sustainability. So today I'm joined by two wonderful speakers. We've got Rob Diamond, as a Senior Sustainability Associate at Ingleton Wood, and Laura Mansel-Thomas, a partner at Ingleton Wood, who have both specialised in sustainable buildings and low energy building design for the past 20 years. And just to introduce myself, my name is Katy, and I've recently completed a doctorate which looked at the impact of boredom on people's wellbeing at work. So my background is more kind of looking at wellbeing in that very kind of human emotional sense. And I work with Baker Stuart now as part of their consultancy team. But today we're going to be looking at more detail at another part of the wellbeing puzzle, which is how the built environment can support wellbeing, and also how buildings can do this while addressing sustainability, which is possibly the other kind of huge issue facing all of us in the workplace industry at the moment. So just an overview of the structure of today's session. I'll do a bit of an introduction to wellbeing and a quick overview of some of the accreditations centered around wellbeing and the built environment. And then Rob will talk through the well building standard, and Laura will look in more depth at ventilation systems and the role that they have to play in making a sustainable difference to wellbeing. So I just want to start by acknowledging kind of what we all know, which is that with the events of the past 18 months, it's never been more important to kind of shine a light on the environment that you create for your employees. And actually people are really answering this call. So this graph shows the amount of Google searches for wellbeing across the world, which hit its highest ever peak in May 2020, according to this Google Trends data, which is pretty amazing. And obviously with the vaccine and the lifting of restrictions, it's brought a lot of optimism, especially in the UK, but we're also still facing lots of new challenges in our return to work. So kind of things around our ability to successfully implement hybrid working environments that are healthy and supportive and productive. So just to kick off, let's take it back to kind of basics and look at what wellbeing actually is. So the World Health Organization in 1948 described it as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And that gives kind of a flavor of how holistic well-being is, encompassing all these physical, mental, and social aspects. And that definition, not merely the absence of disease or infirmity, also demonstrates that well-being is really about thriving. So it's not about mitigating bad things, it's about things actually being good. And that's where positive psychology comes in. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with Martin Seligman, but he pioneered positive psychology as a discipline. And essentially it's an approach to psychology that doesn't just look at psychological dysfunction and mental ill health, but actually looks at how people thrive. So he explains it like this. I realized that my profession was half-baked. It wasn't enough for us to nullify disabling conditions and get to zero. We needed to ask, what are the enabling conditions that make human beings flourish? How do we get from 0 to +5? And that for me is kind of the same philosophy that underpins well-being, because we're not trying to get to 0, we're trying to get to +5. And we can see this change mirrored in the development of the idea of workplace wellbeing. And just to explain that a little bit, we might think of the Health and Safety Act as the beginning of wellbeing because it was kind of the start of employers taking legal responsibility for the welfare of their workers. But it was mainly concerned with mitigating physical risks and getting to 0. So making sure there were no injuries at work caused by negligence or poor job design and things like that. And then in 2008, there was a government review by Dame Carol Black, which set out what she called a new vision for health and work in Britain. And that really properly kickstarted the workplace wellbeing debate in the UK. And the key thing here is it put forward the idea that work shouldn't just not harm us, it should actually be good for us. And that we needed to think about that more holistically and more positively. So that's the kind of +5 thinking. And in 2009, another report came out which reflected, again, this change in focus. And that was a document which was a sort of government framework for supporting good mental health in the workplace. And that's partly a reflection of the changing nature of work, but also an acknowledgement of just how important both physical and mental health are in making work good. So with wellbeing, we're not just mitigating risk or getting to zero, we're actively supporting optimal functioning and productivity at work. But as we know, workplace wellbeing is more than just offering free fruit or having kind of ergonomic desk chairs. It's a holistic concept to do with thriving and enjoyment and happiness and health, which is great. But then how do you kind of break that down? So one way to think of it is as having these kind of two key components. So one which is to do with people and the other which is to do with the built environment. And obviously these are interrelated, but it's quite a useful distinction to make, I think. And this quote from the CIPD is really important in thinking through how to actually do wellbeing well in either of those areas. So they wrote, wellbeing is not just about initiatives, it's about aspiring to position employee wellbeing as a continuous thread that runs through every operational decision, a cultural lens that guides everything we do and how we do it. In business terms, a systems approach. So that begs the question, how do you systematize wellbeing? And at the moment, that's kind of the $1 million question, isn't it? So just thinking now in terms of the built environment, there are some really great accreditations that are worth considering. So firstly, there's the more sort of traditional environmental approach, and these tend to be more focused on a building's environmental performance. So you've got BREEAM, which is the Building Research Establishment's environmental assessment method. And that was introduced in the UK in 1990, and it was specifically designed around assessing the environmental performance of offices. There's also LEED, the Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design accreditation, which was introduced in 1998. Green Star was launched in Australia in 2003. CASB, it's a Japanese accreditation. It's not widely used, but it was introduced in 2004 and is still available. There's also the Living Building Challenge, which is a US-based accreditation, which I think was introduced in 2006. But increasingly, people are turning to accreditations that are based on a more human-centric approach to design. So two examples of this are the IWBI WELL certification, versions 1 and 2, and FitWell, which are both kind of leading the way in terms of providing a kind of rigorous standard for assessing healthy buildings that support well-being in a human-centric way. And the benefit of these accreditations is that they kind of address that middle bit between people and environment. So it's not just, here's a green building, it's here's a green building that also supports people's well-being in these specific measurable ways. So we can see there's kind of a number of accreditations that have standardized the way we approach well-being in the built environment, but I'll now hand over to Rob, who's going to talk you through just one of these, the IWBI's Well Building Standard.
So good morning, everybody. Lovely to see you all here. So yeah, thank you very much, Katy, for that introduction and bringing me on to the next level of sustainability, which is the International Well Building Institute's Well Building Standard. So this is an enhancement, in my opinion, on Fitwell and sort of goes towards the next level of sustainability, kind of beyond BREEAM and where we should really all be going. As it's been sort of insinuated, it's a vehicle for buildings and organisations to really deliver more thoughtful and intentional spaces that enhance human health and well-being. And consequently, well is for people. We all know that we spend 90% of our time in buildings, hopefully not so much with such beautiful weather. And we'll be looking at some of the key concepts that are covered using the WELL scheme, including air, water, nourishment, light, movement, comfort, sound, materials and mind, essentially the whole human being. And I say WELL's the leading tool for advancing health and well-being. Yes, we have FitWell and other new schemes that are coming out, but WELL is really leading the way. It's been around for about 5 years now, and already 5,000 projects plus have been certified all across the globe. And more importantly, and quite appropriately, right now, there's a new health safety rating that's just come out, really to give assurance that health and well-being have been considered when we're returning to work post-COVID, which I'll also touch on this morning. So let's have a look at this well building standard then in more detail. It's split over 100 features into these 7 concepts. And as you'll see, each of these concepts contains multiple dimensions to them that we'll explore briefly this morning. So just to say, and what perhaps one of the criticisms around this whole well idea is, oh, how do we know it's fully, certified? Has it been checked out? Is it fluffy? I've had, but to give you some assurance that this has been underwritten through using medical journals, peer-reviewed papers, doctors, and medical health professionals, and it really does look at the whole of the well-being of a human being in terms of from cardiovascular systems right through to the urinary systems. So it's really sort of holistic in its approach. And yeah, and so it's underwritten by science-based, which kind of gives some sort of assurance that it isn't sort of fluffy and it is based on reality. So how does it work? Well, those that have come across certification schemes before, such as BREEAM, kind of know what this is looking at. It's a bronze, silver, gold, platinum approach here. Platinum being obviously the highest rating, 80% or 80 points required to achieve that. And to say that well can be used not only for shell and core buildings, but also for refurbishments as well as new build. So it really is quite, it's quite global in its approach. It can cover any type of building, and even an office refurbishment, one could consider bringing in the WELL standard, or at least some of the WELL ideas that we're going to be talking about. So let's talk about the first concept, air, which contains 29 features. This is all to do, and obviously Laura will be shortly talking a bit more about ventilation and so forth, but it's about the optimization and quality of indoor air. We need to provide fresh, healthy air that's been properly filtered. It doesn't have microbes and mold, and really reducing air pollution of any kind. We know, or unfortunately, that over 7 million premature deaths arise each year simply because of lack of air quality. So the whole of WELL really looks at making sure the filtration systems are correct, where there's natural ventilation, that it needs to comply with surrounding air quality zones, includes things like no smoking bans, as you'd obviously expect. So moving on to the water side, water quality is highly important here. Well, in fact, obviously it's the second section, and it's really focused on water filtration and treatment, basically to ensure that there's safe, healthy, adequate drinking water for the building occupants. We're probably all aware that we don't drink enough water. We probably all drink far too much tea and coffee. We're supposed to be, for a male, drinking 2.5 litres a day and 2 litres a day for females. But actually, we're probably most of the time dehydrated. And one of the reasons is it's not accessible enough. If it's not available, if it means a long walk, if the water doesn't taste that great, if it's not filtered, if it's not cool, we're unlikely to be drinking so much water. It's far easier, as you probably all know, to switch on the kettle and have a coffee. So WELL really looks to making sure there's healthy well water on board, it's local, and it's available for all occupants. The next section is obviously only relevant where you do have things like restaurants or cafeterias on site, but it really looks at where there is promoting healthy eating. And actually a lot of WELL doesn't need to cost much at all. Sometimes it's as simple as promoting fruit and vegetables and not promoting sort of unhealthy foods. And actually it's found that, just simply by investing, putting healthy food on the table, as it were, for employees, there's so many long-term lasting benefits to the employer in terms of health and well-being, in terms of how they perform, and obviously in terms of long-term health issues that obviously we want to alleviate. Even in the UK, obesity rates are currently climbing, and 1 in 4 adults are considered obese. And obviously risks with obesity include things like diabetes, heart disease, some types of cancer, and even, you know, having strokes. So this is really something that's really important that every employer really needs to give consideration to. And I think Well has really bottomed down the nourishment section. So we move on to light now. So our bodies run, our biorhythms run over essentially roughly a 24-hour period, and we've all got these internal fluctuations, and we're all affected by different times of day, essentially the circadian rhythm. So the level of illumination will have an effect on us, where we sit in terms of office space, if you're near a window, for example, and if you're not, obviously, you know, it really has an impact. Interesting, in hospitals, I know south-facing beds, people get better quicker than on the north side, for example. So all these things can heavily affect our being. So the Well building standard really focuses on lighting systems, looking at things obviously like low energy lighting. There's no reason why Well has to contradict things like BREEAM. So it will include things like efficient lighting, but also it will look at maybe making the light quality better, maybe improving the lighting, maybe increasing light level, say in the afternoon when we all feel a bit drowsy. And one of the reasons is to try and make sure that occupants of these buildings sleep better at night, actually. So it's interesting that during the day, it's what will affect us at night. So really, given that we're the most sleep deprived country in the world, would you believe, we're not getting as much sleep as we should. Anything to do with lighting that's going to help promote healthy sleep is really critical, really. I mean, I know that I don't work as well if I'm really tired, of course not. The next section is obviously all about fitness. We all know that's got to be part of Well, promoting an active, healthy lifestyle and achieving fitness goals for employees. So we need to encourage our users of buildings to get out at lunchtime, to go for walks, to join a gym, to wear a Fitbit, and make sure they've got all the relative health insurance. And this is all covered under Well, and it really gives a lot of encouragement, including things like even, say you've got a lift and you've got stairs, it will encourage people to use the staircase by putting music, by putting artwork, to sort of encourage people to use those staircases rather than take the lift. And we probably all know that we probably only take half of the recommended 150 minutes per week of exercise. The average is about 71 minutes per week. So we're probably all a little bit slacking there. So any additional sort of help we can get, bring it on. Over to comfort and promoting human productivity and ensuring maximum thermal comfort for all building users can be done by designing, controlling the HVAC system, heat, vent, aircon situations. And this will include things as well as improving acoustics, improving olfactory comforts, temperature, humidity control. So although this isn't considered an immediate threat to our health, it does provide a comfortable workspace. So, you know, an employer is able to work in comfort and be more, perform better, feel better, and enjoy being in the workspace more, which I think is, you know, we a lot of us are returning to work, a lot of us have been working from home. We want to know that where we're going is as comfortable or even more enhanced than our own homes. And key is this body-mind connection, this connection with our minds, of course. So this is going to be affected by all sorts of things, including ventilation, lighting, water systems. It also includes things like our connection with nature, what we call the biophilic design elements, incorporating plants, green roofs, greenery. When we do have greenery implemented into the offices, as you saw at the beginning, our London office has really incorporated greenery, nature, and it's up to something like a 15% increase in employee well-being, higher productivity rates of around 6%. And interestingly, and depending on obviously what industry you work in, certainly where I work, creativity. a real need for that. And yeah, this is critical for the mind, including, you know, encouraging people to go out, go for walks, go to parks, etc. So this is the well concept in a nutshell. I've kind of covered version 1. Version 2 is just out, which kind of enhances on this, but this gives you an idea of the sort of scorecard that is used, running through each of these concepts and looking at moving from an uncertified building right through to the platinum level. So how about the health safety rating that I mentioned? Well, this is really been introduced simply to give assurance that, you know, we're coming back from post-COVID-19. Let's give confidence that our health and safety has been prioritised. You can be assured that any buildings that's got the well health safety rating have taken this extremely seriously. And it's very much focused on things like cleaning, sanitising procedures. And that includes things like making sure the chemicals used in the cleaning products are low VOC, for example. It looks at, well, what do we do if there was another outbreak, making sure we can deal with that effectively. It looks at making sure people have got access to health services. It makes sure that air quality, which obviously Laura's going to be talking more about, is up to scratch. It makes sure the water quality is up to scratch. Workstations are cleaned regularly. And it also has assurance that all the stakeholders are engaged and that the procedures are communicated effectively. So let's look at a couple of case studies before I hand over. So just to say, this kind of shows that, you know, UK buildings are taking on the WELL standard. The first one was the first project actually in all of Europe, was Cundall's head office. So we've got some typical costs of around £55,000 to incorporate WELL. Of course, it doesn't need to cost anywhere near that, but this was a new build development. What was interesting is, and what was found was the reduction in staff turnover, 27% drop, which obviously saves huge amounts of money, retraining people, re-looking for the right staff. You want people to stay. This is one way of doing it. It's looking at a 50% drop in lower absenteeism. If people are feeling better, they're sleeping better, they're going to be less sick, therefore they're going to be more effective. So yeah, within 3 months, it was really noticeable that the reductions in sick leave and attrition, according to Amy Shuttleworth, their head of sustainability. So just on that basis alone, it's paid back time and time again, year on year. Similarly, Manchester's Hilson Moran offices. So this is Well AP, which is, I'm one of that, an accredited professional. And again, satisfaction levels outshone all the sort of current buildings. And it was a real shift in office culture. We looked at collaboration spaces, we looked at communal spaces, which was where people can work together. And yet there's acoustically lined rooms where people can have their own privacy and concentrate maybe on an important report that needs going out. And so it ended up being a massive company-wide shift in the whole way health and wellbeing was looked at. People start seeing the real benefits. So to conclude, clearly well-compliant buildings can help create a built environment, improving nutrition, improving fitness. Our moods are better, we sleep better, we therefore perform better. So this is the core mission of WELL, to make businesses more effective, making the employees more productive, and in my opinion, happier. So if we can embrace some WELL strategies, obviously we don't need to go for full certification, but if we can embrace some of these strategies, we can build back better and improve health and well-being, and actually provide a welcoming return to workplace. So I think this is the future. I think we need to embrace this opportunity. This is a great time to do it. So thank you very much for listening. I'll hand over now to Laura.
Right, hi everybody. I'm hoping you can hear me. And what I can't tell is what you can see. I think it's probably the wrong screen. Thank you, Rachel. If someone can tell me whether that's now the right screen, that would be great. Thank you. And I'll just get myself organised and we'll be ready to go. I was presenting yesterday in a completely different piece of software which works in a totally different way, so my apologies. I'm Laura Mansel-Thomas. I'm senior partner at Ingleton Wood. I'm a building services engineer by background, much like Rob, and head up our sustainability team, but I also act as HR partner. So the issue of ventilation in offices and office environments really does cross over all of those responsibilities. I'm going to talk about a slightly different approach to considering ventilation in buildings that really came from thinking about our own offices and how we could use them as we come out of the pandemic. So most offices in the UK aren't the exemplar designs that we see in the trade press. And I've got this lovely image here, which is the very beautiful Mason Brothers project. It won International Project of the Year at the CIBSE Awards in 2020. And importantly, the award noted that Mott MacDonald ran more than 30 different simulations to come up with the best solution here for ventilation, energy consumption and daylighting. It's truly a very lovely space backed up by post-occupancy surveys that show it's very popular. But I suspect many of us actually work in offices that look a bit more like this. Most offices are naturally ventilated, hopefully with some good openable windows and perhaps some air conditioning. They might look something like this or this. Constructed in the last 25 years, meeting building regulations, but probably not much more. And if we're lucky, with air conditioning retrofitted as well. Nobody's run 30 simulations on these buildings to check how they work or dared to ask the occupants afterwards how they feel in a post-occupancy survey. And air conditioning, importantly for today's subject, is not the same as mechanical ventilation. Now, an office may indeed have both, but the cheap and cheerful split units that we often see are only conditioning the air in the room. They warm the air or they cool the air, but they're not part of a wider ventilation system, and they're often referred to as comfort cooling or comfort heating. These systems take air that's already in a room, they warm it or cool it and release it back, they recirculate it in the space. But it's really important to understand that these systems aren't delivering outside air and they're not diluting any airborne pathogens, any smells, or any carbon dioxide levels. They'll make the air feel fresher, they'll make it cooler, but that doesn't mean it is fresher. Now, to go back to what Rob was saying about well-being, we really should start to take good ventilation as a starting point and not just a nice to have. COVID has definitely made us all wake up to the environments in which we spend our time. And home working has made many people think about the conditions that they accept or used to accept in their office. Now, well-being, as Rob mentioned, can sometimes be seen as something intangible. You know, it's a nice to have, it's a bit fluffy, it's not a must have, especially for companies now driven by worries about productivity, worries about the financial bottom line post-COVID. But raised carbon dioxide levels, almost always brought about by poor ventilation, have a direct impact on productivity, and it's been measured and reported in numerous research papers. And for those of us who work on education buildings, we know there's very tight carbon dioxide limits in classrooms under the guidance of the BB 101 document. We did some experiments in one of our own offices. We shut the windows, we had everyone sitting there working, and we measured carbon dioxide rates well above 2000 ppm. Now, if you look at this graph, that's well into the general drowsiness and getting towards adverse health issues. We did then open the windows again. So if you're wondering why, once COVID's no longer an issue, you should worry about office ventilation, then actually the financial payoff for doing something might be more direct than you think. And couple this with staff who are more aware than ever of their surroundings, and doing nothing might really not be an option. Now, introducing a mechanical ventilation to an office a new mechanical system is great, but it can be expensive, and many, perhaps most of us, probably don't own the offices that we work in, but we lease them on relatively short leases, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. Capital costs for installing new ventilation systems may well make no sense at all over the time frame of a lease. So if we've worked out what ventilation our office does or does not have, what comes next? And there's one more important component in the design of a ventilation system that we haven't talked about, and that's people. So crucially, the fresh air requirement in an office is based on the number of people in the space. So that's the number of people at a given time working in the space, that concept of design occupancy. But design occupancy needs to be a real occupancy as well. And reducing the number of people in an office might mean that the ventilation goes from poor to very good without actually changing anything. And the extreme of this approach was found during the pandemic. So our environmental design team modelled each of our offices to determine the appropriate occupancy. And we followed the good practice ventilation guidelines for COVID-19 that were issued by the HSE, by government, by CIBSE, among others. And we used things like the BCO guidance for fresh air for people in office space. So this particular example is looking at a naturally ventilated office, which pre-COVID had 13 people in it. We used a rate of 12 litres per second per person of fresh air, which is the BCO rate. Others used 10 or perhaps even 8 litres per second. But the blue area here is the minimum desired ventilation rate for the number of people. And we showed that the ventilation rate fell below the desired minimum for around 26% of the time. And therefore we couldn't reoccupy with the full 13 people. We reconsidered our occupancy. We set maximum occupancies for each of our offices and for each of the spaces in each of our offices. And that's what we're using at the moment. We've had a very light return to the office in May. We've been very careful to make sure that people are socially distanced. And we're opening all the windows and following the guidance that comes from these calculations. And even post-pandemic, all the research is suggesting that most office-based staff want to work from home for something like 50% of the time. Our own internal survey suggesting a working pattern of 2 or 3 days at home, 2 or 3 days in the office is the most popular. This is repeated across the country, it's not just us. So it's highly likely that come September, October time, people will be going back to the office in a much lighter way. Perhaps not all of them with chickens on their desks at home, but some of us are luckier than others. So working in this way might, I'm sorry if these are a little bit blurred, these images, but working in this way might inadvertently solve many of our ventilation problems without any excessive cost at all. We simply reduce the occupancy, but it's important to remember that this is just a statistical model. There's a really famous George Box quote, which says all models are wrong, but some are useful. So we need to think about how we can make this model useful. So staff working from home 50% of the time could still mean that all the staff are in the office on one day and none the next. It doesn't mean the office has 50% occupancy. So careful planning is needed. The statistical model only gets us so far. And after that, as always with managing people, it's about the staff, it's about communication, and it's about managing people, spaces, and time. Important to think as well that changes in occupancy patterns might also mean more cellular spaces. It might mean we need acoustically lined rooms for Zoom calls and virtual meetings, and fewer general open plan office spaces. And that might mean rethinking the ventilation, whether it's natural or mechanical, to make sure we can reach all the spaces within an office environment. So what can we do about this? Oh, excuse me. So the first thing is we need to know how our building works. I don't know how many of us really truly know how the space we sit in works. How is it ventilated? Is it naturally ventilated? Is the system energy efficient? And I haven't even touched on the conflict here between air quality and energy efficiency. If we've got mechanical systems running at full pelt to give us as much fresh air as possible, then we do need to think about how energy efficient that actually is. And then what issues are we actually trying to address? Are we still in pandemic mode? Are we still worried about virus loads? Are we still worried about social distancing? And so we need to know how our buildings are used as well as how they work. So how many people use the space, and how does their work pattern affect the occupancy level? And that might be a suck it and see. We might need to get people back and see how it actually works. So this is really just refining that assumption to go back to think about design occupancy. It's about constantly refining that design occupancy and thinking how you want to use the space and how you can make it work for you. And then we need to do something. And I think the important thing here is that we're not necessarily aiming for perfect. We just need to aim for better. So we need to make sure that windows can be opened safely. And we need to make sure that the furniture layout, as far as possible, keeps people out of drafts. And that way they might actually open the windows rather than close them. So you can't think about one without thinking about the other. Do the windows open inwards or outwards? Do they have restrictors on them? How can we make sure that we get decent airflow? And coupled with that, we need to remember that natural ventilation is massively more efficient if it's cross rather than single-sided ventilation. So windows on opposite sides of the room. And if that's not possible, perhaps keeping a door open so that you've got windows in one place that you get some airflow through the space to another. Even open windows on two sides of a corner are better than just on the one side. And if that's not possible, sometimes maybe we can think about roof vents to supplement windows. Are there other ways to just improve that airflow? If you've got mechanical ventilation, please have it maintained regularly. As with any system, that's the first step to getting it working efficiently and effectively. Make sure filters are changed, make sure the system is clean, make sure the controls work so it's functioning how you think it is, and working, as I say, efficiently and effectively for you. One way, if you have got a mechanical system, to allow you to bring in more fresh air, and this is the only slide I think where I'm getting a bit more technical, is to use something like a heat recovery system. This means that you can bring in more of that cold, fresh air, shown in green at the top. It gets preheated by the warm air coming out, but it doesn't mix with it, and then you get a nicely warmed, fresh supply. This means you can increase the amount of fresh air into a space without dramatically increasing the amount of energy used. As I say, there's very often a conflict between the air quality and the energy use in a space. And we do need to remember that above all of this, the climate crisis is still there, and we do still need to think about how we can operate effectively and efficiently. Oh, one more technical slide, but not very technical. So if you have got air conditioning, actually sometimes a simple mechanical ventilation system can be incorporated into it. So you see all those connections on those units. Many units, and we've discovered the ones in our office, which I'm looking upwards here, are a case in point, can be adapted to take a fresh air connection. So now they're not just cooling and heating stale air, but they're introducing a small amount of fresh air at the same time and preheating it or pre-cooling it. And also remember that the solutions might be different for rooms in different places in the same building. So a ground floor office next to a busy road might need a mechanical ventilation system with some carefully sited intakes for the fresh air. An office on the second floor, meanwhile, could have openable windows. If you look at a graph of air quality with height above a busy street, the air quality improves incredibly quickly. Most of those pollutants are sitting down at low level. So the second floor, third floor could have openable windows. And then if you looked at how the air moves around the building, and take these as an extreme example, as you get higher up, then obviously the wind might mean that you need sealed windows once again. Similarly, you might have different solutions for a south-facing, east-facing facade, or on different days, depending on how windy it is. And finally, you do need to make sure that the occupants know how it all works. Do they understand the occupancy limits? Do they understand what you've been designing to? Is the ventilation system, if it's mechanical, switched on? Is it being controlled properly? Or are the windows open when the building's occupied? We have a first step here when we come into the office that the first person has to open the windows on both sides of the office. They have to get that air flowing through as soon as there's anyone in the space. And obviously don't forget that you can always ask an expert. There are plenty of us around, and as I say, there's often very simple things we can do to improve office spaces as we start to reoccupy them after the pandemic. So thank you very much. Thanks for taking the time to listen. I think we've asked if you've got any questions to put them into the Q&A, and we'll go through them for either me or Robert at the end. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Laura and Rob and Katie. That was brilliant. We have a few questions in here, so I'll just I'll go through them. We have one which is the use of probiotics in ventilation systems a consideration in the wellbeing framework?
Okay, so I'm assuming that's aimed at me, but maybe Laura's also got an opinion of that. Not currently, in short. Obviously, it's quite relatively new systems. However, there are innovation credits in Well. So, yeah, so if there are innovations, if there's innovative products, this can be put in as a possible credit. Whether or not it will be awarded, I don't know. But yeah, clearly, all new systems are being checked out. And all their medical health well-being sort of benefits are also being looked at. So it does give opportunities for new systems that are coming in, and we're always looking at the very latest in technologies.
Great, thanks, Rob. We have one for Laura. There are much more cost-effective solutions to changing the air conditioning, which is very expensive.
Yeah, I think that one's linked with the one about commercial air filters. I think that's about UV filters, which are, if you Google, there's a huge number of companies out there producing UV filters. I believe that the research shows that in order for a UV filter to work, you'd have to have either a massive UV filter or be passing a very large amount of air through it all the time to actually make it work in the space. I think it works in research. I don't believe there's much out there to show that they really work in a real life scenario. I'm happy to be proved otherwise. I think there's simpler things we can do around occupancy, around natural ventilation, without going to those kind of high-tech solutions. But as I say, happy to be proved wrong if someone's got a real world example.
Thanks, Laura. Rob, you mentioned wellbeing includes communal and collaborating spaces. How is this to be managed with COVID risk, do you think?
I think Paul Denny has obviously got, Paul has already got some communal space that he's looking at well, which is great. Yeah, I mean, collaborative areas in particular obviously need to be managed with obviously in light of COVID. So obviously the Well standard was developed pre-COVID. So in a way, this new health safety rating has been brought in order to deliver safe, assured buildings. Now, in terms of collaborative spaces fitting into existing buildings or separate buildings, obviously buildings, well, like human beings, we're all very much connected. So in a way, it needs to be controlled. Well, let's say it's a communal space on one floor. Well, as a minimum, I would say that one floor would need to be delivered a COVID secure environment. I don't think you could have a space within a space, as it were. You'd have to look at the whole sort of sense of, or at least maybe one tenant taking on, looking at a health safety rating. I don't think you could have a particular area. Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Another one for you, Rob, I think. Looking just at the acoustic requirements in Well, there are several conflicts with BREEAM HEA 05 credits. Is Well intended to replace the complement BREEAM?
It is absolutely meant to complement BREEAM, but of course, in terms of both energy and acoustics, health and well-being, they both have their their benefits really. That I think Well obviously is very much focused on human beings, and BREEAM is very much in concentrating on environmental aspects. Obviously, it does have its own health and well-being section, which obviously you've highlighted there with HA5. I would look that either BREEAM or Well or both are considered for building design, because you know, they both serve their purposes. So it's a bit like horses for courses, as it were.
Can I just come back on the filters? Sorry, because the question's saying it's about air purifiers, not UV filters. A lot of air purifiers have UV filters in them anyway. And I think the issue with the air purifiers is that they might work in a very small space. A lot of them are designed for laboratory scenarios. But I think the problem is that once you're talking about an office building, I'm not convinced that an air purifier will be your solution. And it's certainly in terms of you're talking about viruses and COVID, I think you're unlikely to have the level of filtration that will really filter out viruses. Again, I'm happy to see some real world examples. Sorry, Rachel, thank you.
That's okay. Someone asked, do you have any comments, advisory offices in historic buildings? For example, making sure sash windows open at the top for draft-free ventilations and making sure secondary glazing opens too.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that one. I think the thing about sash windows is that they're a brilliant design, like lots of those sorts of things, where if you open sash windows at the top and bottom, you get a really good circulation of air with low level air coming in at the bottom and circulating out at the top. And not many people realise that that's the way to get them to work. You need to have them, as the questioner says, you need to have them openable at the top and the bottom for really good ventilation. The other thing I'd say about historic buildings, having worked years ago on places like the Science Museum, is that very often they were designed really well when they were built to work incredibly efficiently. And then we did things like fill in all the courtyards so that the ventilation was no longer cross ventilation, it was just from one side, or we put an extra story on top. And sometimes with a historic building, just going back to look at how it was originally designed and to think about how the original building would have worked can give you a lot of hints as to the answer.
Brilliant, thank you. Sorry, Laura, there's another one here for you. As a landlord, we operate 100,000 square feet of multi-tenanted office space. During the lockdown, we installed mechanical heat recovery ventilation in all spaces that didn't have it. We are now looking at UV disinfecting systems in every AC unit. What is your view?
So, hi Paul. So I touched on that with the question about UV filters. I think we'd be more than happy to look at that with you. My view would tend to be that I'm not sure you're going to get the return from the investment in doing it, but that's possibly a controversial view. There's a lot of people out there looking at UV systems, tend to think that it's not really going to give the return that you will expect for it. But as I say, I think it's probably a bigger question to look at, and specifically what types of spaces you're looking at and the scale and things like that.
Great. We've got some really good questions here. There's another one here. Given that most of our employees will be working from home 2 or 3 days per week, can employers be expected to have a responsibility for their employees' working environment at home?
So I can put my HR hat on, if you like, for that one, and say what our view on it is. And our view is that we're not asking anybody to work permanently at home. Obviously, working during a pandemic is slightly different. And therefore, we will be responsible for the work environment, and staff, to a very large extent, will be responsible for their home environment. And if people want to have an ergonomic chair, or they need particular adaptations, generally we'll do that in the office space, not at home. That will be different if you've got people who are working full-time at home, I suspect, and there's quite a lot of information around there from CIPD and people like that as well about responsibilities. That's the line we're taking. If you need us to support you, then come into the office.
Yes. Another one, talking about energy efficiency and keeping natural ventilation, i.e. windows and doors open, to keep the area cool with the use of air conditioning. On how does this meet with WELL? I think one for you, Rob.
Yeah, it is. So sometimes, well, as Adrian James sort of mentioned about HA5, sometimes there's contradiction in terms of just energy efficiency. If you're looking purely at energy efficiency, sometimes WELL is not in your favour. For example, ventilation requirements are higher in WELL than it would be, say, in BREEAM or whatever the CIPC standards are. So we're looking at increasing in ventilation rates. We're looking at increasing filtration levels, which again are going to have effect on fans and so forth. So in terms of nat vent systems, cooling and using air conditioning, well, that's not very it's not very energy efficient, because effectively you're cooling the planet. Similar to if you're running a boiler in your heating system with the windows open, you're heating the planet. So yeah, so in terms of health and well-being, you can get well using full aircon, you can get well using that vent, and you can get well using hybrid systems. But actually, you've got to be careful here in terms of design, that you don't have systems fighting each other. And yeah, you need to sort of somehow control that. And there are obviously techniques, systems and designs that mean you don't need to do what is being suggested by Keith there. So thanks.
Thank you. Laura, we have a mechanical fresh air intake system with a non-passive mechanical extraction. You mentioned about source. Is extraction just as important or less important, do you think?
The key thing is getting the fresh air in. There's two ways of doing it. Well, there's lots of ways of doing it. And what you're describing there, where you've simply got effectively one fan, you can either use that one fan to blow some air in, or you can use that one fan to take some air out. The advantage of having a fresh air intake system that you describe is that you can direct the air to where you want it. It's the analogy is always about whether you blow out a candle or try and suck it to make it go out. If you suck, you won't get the candle flame to go out. You haven't got much control over where that air's going, but if you blow, you can specifically direct the air. So I would have thought what you're describing there is a system where you're trying to get air to particular spaces, and that mechanical air system will do that for you. So my answer would generally be it depends, but it sounds as if what you've got there will work for you.
Great, thank you. I think we've just got time for one last more. Rob, can you get a health and safety rating for a part of a building, i.e. communal areas?
I don't know that you can, truth be known. I think simply because of the nature of well, it's very much inclusive to all sort of the areas, interconnecting areas. So I think really you can't just do one single area. Not effectively. You may be able to introduce some well benefits to a particular area. For example, you might introduce fresh drinking water. You may look at the ventilation rate. You may put some plants in. You may bring some artwork in. You may provide some sort of collaborative working environment with acoustics. You probably won't be able to get full certification, but you probably could, as I say, get some sort of well benefits in a communal area.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Rob. I will pass over to Katy to kind of have the final word, as it were.
Yeah, just to say thank you to everybody for joining us. I mean, those questions were so great. This is obviously not my area of expertise, but I found it really interesting. So yeah, thank you to Rob, Laura and Rachel as well for facilitating. And if you have any questions or follow up, we will send out our contact details and we'll send out the recording. So yeah, we'll be in touch with those. And yeah, just thank you for joining us. It's been great.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.